Good evening, USA. We have a very special evening planned for you tonight. The focus of tonight is going to be all about the Constitution. Let's go on a journey back to 1781 to the beginning of the American government. Let's develop an understanding of what was wrong with the Articles, who opposed the Constitution, and how the country began to flourish under the two governments. Who were the Federalists and Anti-Federalists? Who was protected in the Articles? Who was protected in the Constitution? Tonight, we are taking a journey back to the beginning of the American government. We hope you enjoy. Welcome to our special segment on the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution.
We're going to start off by explaining a few key terms and ideas that are vital to understanding our history. First off, we need to have an understanding of what is federalism.
Federalism is the distribution of power between states and national government. In the Articles of Confederation, the state had more power. With the Constitution, the national government has more power.
The next thing we got to understand is the differences in beliefs between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, which are the two main groups during this time period. The Federalists supported the Constitution and a strong central government, while the Anti-Federalists wanted to keep the national government weaker, did not support the Constitution, and if it was to be ratified, argued for a Bill of Rights.
The entire process of trying to create a new government began with the Constitutional Convention, in which delegates from many states came to try and create a new, stronger central government because the Articles of Confederation were just too weak. George Washington, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton were the most recognized and important members that attended the Constitutional Convention on May 25, 1787 to September 17, 1787.
The Articles are just too weak. The national government has no power to tax, no power to enforce the laws they passed, and no army to protect themselves. They were essentially useless and could not support a country. Stay tuned for an exclusive interview with James Madison.
Welcome back. Joining us now is James Madison, who attended the Constitutional Convention and took notes of what happened in his diary. This diary contains all the important events and points brought up in this convention. Now, James, could you please explain some topics that were included in the Constitution?
Well, one of the most important parts was the separation of powers, and in that we divided the government into three major parts: the judicial, the executive, and the legislative.
And what powers do each of these branches have?
Well, the judicial branch, they check the constitutionality of all the laws that are passed by the legislative branch. The legislative branch obviously passes the laws, and the executive branch helps carry them out.
Could you give us a few examples?
Well, the judicial branch obviously checks the constitutionality of the laws. So if a law is passed by the legislative branch that is unconstitutional, they can basically say that it cannot be passed, it cannot go into effect. The executive branch, that's where the president is. The president has the power to veto a law that the legislative branch gives out, but that also gives Congress the power to override his veto if the majority of them still want it.
The legislative branch is bicameral. How did that become?
Alright, well, there was two plans proposed. The first one was called the New Jersey Plan, and that focused on smaller states because it gave equal representation to the people. So even if you come from a smaller state with a smaller population, you still have equal representation than the larger states with a greater population. The second plan was called the Virginia Plan, and it focused more on states with a larger population, larger states. So if you had a greater population in the state, you would have more representation. The compromise came around with the Connecticut Compromise, which created a bicameral system. So there was the Senate and the House. The Senate focused on equal representation, so the New Jersey Plan, and the House of Representatives focused more on the Virginia Plan and more on population.
Well, thanks, James Madison, for taking your time to come on to our show.
Thanks for having me.
Stay tuned for a special roundtable discussion about the strengths and weaknesses of the two governments. Welcome to our roundtable discussion about the strengths and weaknesses of both governments.
Omar, could you please tell us some of the strengths of the Articles?
Well, I sure can. Now, first off, we know that the Articles helped win the Revolution, and without that, we wouldn't have a country. Second of all, we had the Northwest Land Ordinance, which helped the country grow. Without the Articles, our country would not be where it is.
Michelle, could you tell us some of the strengths?
Well, first of all, we had something called the separation of powers, which means we had more than one branch. We had the judicial, the executive, and the legislative branch, which gave us the power to actually, run the country. Other than that, in our legislative branch, we had a bicameral system which allowed representation both by population and equal representation from all the states. Also, we could actually, tax, so we can actually have money in our system. Other than
Well,
that,
I'd like to cut you off at that point, because our land ordinance did help with our taxes to pay for our debt from the revolution.
did it really? Well, even though you had the Northwest Land Ordinance, something still happened, something called maybe Shays' Rebellion. Why? Because people were losing their farms.
Due to what reason? Taxes.
Very true. But you did not have the correct power to tax from the national government. If you had the power to tax from the national government, there would be an equal fair tax from all the people. And with that equal fair tax from all the people, Shays' Rebellion would have never happened. People would not be losing their farms.
I see you struggling a little bit here, so I'm going to tell you. Now, one of your weaknesses is that you have an electoral college to elect our president. Now, who's to say that's not going to stop from a tyrant running our country?
The Electoral College is a system that we devised because the people do not know what is almost best for them. They elect the electors. These electors are knowledgeable people that know what is best for the country. These people will elect a president that will do what he needs to do for our country. He will help our country thrive and survive. And might I add, a country that is now using the what? The Constitution to run their government. Where's the Articles of Confederation? All right, they're gone because they failed.
Okay, we're going to give our two experts some extra time to cool down. Stay tuned for our next segment. And welcome back. The conversation has come to the Constitution and what it mentioned about slavery.
Well, personally, I think one of the most important things mentioned in the Constitution about slavery is the fact that they banned slave trade. No more African slaves were going to be coming in.
The thing is, though, we still have a slave trade going on in America. It did not abolish slavery permanently.
So what do you think is important?
Well, I think the 3/5 compromise is really important during that time.
The 3/5 compromise was an extremely important part of creating the House of Representatives because with each additional person counted within the states, the number would go up, and that would mean more representatives in the House of Representatives. Well, the North did not want slaves counted as people because they didn't have as many of them up in the North. In the South, however, with the large plantations, each person wanted their slaves to be counted as one person. Eventually, the government decided to make each slave worth 3/5 of a person in order to please both sides.
So, what else does the Constitution talk about in regards to slavery?
Well, the last thing the Constitution talked about was the fugitive slave law, which would be when your property or your slaves, if they ran away from you, the government would help you retrieve them.
Now, let's shift to the Federalist Papers. So, we know that the Federalist Papers were written by James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay. Now, these were a series of essays written to kind of convince New York into ratifying the Constitution.
Because of the strong central government and the Bill of Rights that the Federalists finally agreed to.
Well, we know this is a good form of government because it's still around today.
And thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time on Hause History Channel.